This is, I think, the first ever dedicated event we've done for grandmas, so we're really excited about that. Yeah. If you want to find out more about us, definitely check out our website, AAWW.org. We have an online magazine called The Margins. We're on social media. We have an email newsletter. And also, if you're a writer, we have fellowships. And then right now, we have is a submissions period for our biggest fellowship, which is called the Margins Fellowship. It's a fellowship for emerging Asian, Arab, and Muslim writers in New York City, if you're under 30. And it's a really amazing fellowship. It comes with a $5,000 stipend, mentorship, and a residency opportunity at the Malay Colony, which is in upstate New York. And our Margins Fellows go on to do like really incredible things and make a lot of progress on their writing projects while they're fellows here. So definitely check it out if you're interested. And in terms of events, just want to shout out to some ones we have coming up. Next Tuesday, we have like a really incredible poetry reading with Fatima Asghar and Vivek Shraya. We anticipate selling out, but we also live stream all of our events. So in the case that that happens, just check us out on Facebook, and you can tune in wherever you are on the internet. Next Thursday, August 30th, we're hosting a launch event for A World Without Cages, which is our new editorial initiative to write about prisons, to ask Asian Americans to write about how they relate to incarceration or how that is related to our story of being in the United States. But also publishing writing by people who are in jails, prisons, and immigrant detention centers. And so this event on next Thursday is actually a book drive. So we're going to talk about the importance of people who are incarcerated having access to reading material and the kind of stuff that they want to read. And then we're also going to talk about what we're trying to do with this project. So if you're interested, come check it out, get involved. We'll have bubble tea. It'll be really great. And then the last thing I want to mention briefly is that we have on September 5th a reading with our Muslim community fellows. So they're going to be reading from their pieces of nonfiction and reportage on the Muslim communities of New York City. So definitely check that out too. And then, of course, we are a nonprofit, so if you'd like to donate to us, that sounds awesome. We have a donation jar right here. We have donation jar near the drink section also. And then if you didn't notice on your way in, we have 2 bathrooms over there in the hallway. And we're selling copies of Kate's book in the back, so check it out. Yeah, so now I'm just going to introduce Kate, and we can get started for tonight. In Kate Gavino's new graphic novel, an ominous condition known as Sanpaku plagues the waking life of young Marcine. When Marcine learns about the theory, which says that seeing the white around the iris of your eyes is a bad omen, she begins to see it everywhere, in her ailing Lola, her classmates, and even JFK. Sanpaku is a stark and explorative debut that examines what it means to challenge and clings to old beliefs in the process of forging one's values and identity. Sierra Hahn writes, cartoonist Kate Gavino is primed to be one of her generation's most refreshing and honest voices in comics. Kate is a writer and illustrator and the creator of the website Last Night's Reading, which was compiled into a published collection by Penguin Books in 2015. We have a copy in the back if you want to check it out. And her work has been featured in places like BuzzFeed, Lenny Letter, and Oprah.com. Please welcome Kate Gavino.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm thrilled about this reading. I chose this grandmother theme because in my book, Marcine's Lola is kind of the haunting figure throughout the entire book. And Lolas and grandmothers in general have always just been a favorite topic of mine. And in college, I was in a fiction writing workshop. And if you've ever been in a writing workshop before, you get really familiar with the other writers in your workshop. And everyone kind of has a favorite subject. There's the person that always writes about sex, the person that always writes about spirituality, and my particular beat was grandmothers. Whether they were religious grandmothers, shoplifting grandmothers, slutty grandmothers, like I loved writing about them. So that's why I'm so happy to have found this particular lineup of writers who just seem to be as obsessed with grandmothers as I am. So I'm really excited to hear their stories tonight. So the first reader tonight is Angela Chen. Angela Chen is a science journalist at The Verge. Her reporting and essays have also been published in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Paris Review, Hazlitt, and more. And she writes a monthly narrative column for Catapult called Data. Her first book, Ace, is forthcoming from Beacon Press.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. My piece is about both of my grandmothers, and I do have a favorite. This is a little bit of an awkward setup. All right. My grandmothers met each other before my parents did, which is a side effect of the fact that my parents grew up in the same town in China and met when they were in first grade. This was also the town where I was born, and from what I hear, there was a little bit of rivalry between the two families. My father's family was wealthier, but my mother's mother was a school principal, which was a big deal at the time, and all three of their daughters went to college, which was an even bigger deal. Except for my immediate family, almost all my relatives still live in China, and I've had minimal contact with my grandmothers for the past 2 decades. Yet they played an enormous and lasting role in my life because briefly, they were my parents. They were the ones that raised me when my actual parents left for the United States. I was 2, and because I was denied a visa 3 times, I stayed behind. I'll call my mother's mom Fern, because we all know you're not supposed to call your elders by their first names, and it feels vaguely disrespectful to use her real one. So Fern was always sick, so for 3 years I was raised by my father's family, including my other grandmother, Lisa. There was no internet, calling was expensive, and they had to mail pictures. For all that I could understand then, my parents were actually and completely gone. We have stereotypes of Asian grandmas. They're usually sort of cute, maybe, doting, superstitious, nosy. But my grandmothers are one of the only people in my life who are Asian, obviously, and yet I never actually noticed their Asianness or experienced them as Asian because I've never seen them against the backdrop of not Asia. I've only ever interacted with them in China, and when everyone is Asian, being Asian fades into the background. Stereotypes fall away when I think of them, in ways that they don't when I think of my parents or even myself. They're oddly free to be whoever they want, and they're examples of how diverse Asian grandmas can be, which is my way of warning you that one of them was not cute or doting. So, Lisa clearly favored my cousins, twin boys 8 years older than me, and yes, I'm still a little bitter. As a caretaker, she can only be described as apathetic, and I remember as a kid feeling that I was a burden to her. I hid in small nooks because I was curious if anyone would try to find me. Years later, when I was in late elementary school visiting, I accidentally let the door lock behind her when she stepped out. To my 7-year-old brain, this was a very sophisticated and subtle, tale of revenge. Fern, on the other hand, always praised me and told everyone how bright I was. She wore a scarf, even on the hottest days, and I loved the occasional weekends when I would see her. I would sit on a stool in her tiny apartment, and she would tell me stories that might have been traditional folk tales or might have been weird stories she made up. One was about a girl who had very thin hair. Fern had very thin hair, and who wanted thicker hair, so she stole magic corn and ate it, and then she grew hair all over her body and turned into an animal. So, of course, I was scared of corn for a long time. And by the way, if you know that this is an actual folktale, please let me know, because I'm honestly not sure if she made it up or not. It's a funny thing to be raised by such dueling attitudes, by one woman who believed you were another mouth to feed and not as good as the boys, and another one who praised you and thought you were special. There used to be these commercials on TV. They're ads for early childhood services, and they said something like, the first 5 years are the most important. As a science journalist, I frequently read psychology papers, and so I know those ads have a point. Those first 5 years, and the people in them, help us create a personal narrative, a story about our lives and why things happen, and that story then influences the way we behave later. Say you ask someone on a date and they say no. It could be that you're great, but you're just not that type, or it could be that you're fundamentally unlovable. Which story will you believe? That's the power of personal narrative. In the absence of my parents, and with their treatment of me informed by the fact that they weren't my parents, my grandmothers fundamentally shaped the contours of my personality and how I saw the world. Recently, my dad told me a family story I hadn't heard before. During the Cultural Revolution, some of our more distant relatives were in danger of being sent away for re-education. To avoid that, Lisa took them in and housed them and fed them for years. It's a feat of sacrifice and family loyalty that I truly admire, and it's also strange to hear about because, frankly, most of the time I relate to her on, you might have noticed, this vindictive level, with the outsized anger of a child, even though it's hardly the worst thing in the world to be raised by someone who's still basically Attica. Another story. My grandfather's sick and a grumpy old man, and sometimes he'll yell at Lisa to get out, and then she'll yell back that, this house is in her name, and it's always been in her name, and he should be respectful. And you know what? I respect that. The older I get, even as my interactions with my grandmothers don't really increase, I find myself rewriting our history, placing her in her own life, beyond just her and me. This is something that all of us realize at some point. It's that moment of, oh, my parents had a life before I was born. I'm just simply realizing in a very specific way with Lisa. It's one-sided. She's far away because of borders and distance and immigration and age. Maybe that's what it means to me to have an Asian grandma, that because of the Asian qualifier, I've grown up very far away without the repeated contact that could have made her a more full person, her own person in my mind. She is Asian, and I'm Asian American, and because of this gulf, we never had any opportunity to build anything else, to erase the bad beginnings. As a rule, I try to see others as people beyond who they are to me, and so my version of filial piety now is to try my best to step outside my personal narrative and add to what I know and try to switch my view just a little. I try now, even with the distance, to hear more and learn more. She shaped me. I want to cross that distance and shape how I see her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Our next reader is Vivian Lee. Vivian is an editor at Little A, Amazon Publishing's literary fiction and narrative nonfiction imprint. And she is a 2018 Publishers Weekly Rising Star honoree. Her writing can be found at the Los Angeles Times, Eater, The Rumpus, World Policy Journal, Epicurious, Entropy, Taste, Shondaland, and more.
Thank you, Kate, for inviting me to be reading with this wonderful group, and for Asian American Writers Workshop for always being a wonderful beacon of community and creativity. I'm super honored to be reading today. I'm going to be reading, if you heard my bylines, I love writing about food, so, as most Asians do. So I'm going to be reading about my grandma and also really about my first love is just food. Some of my earliest memories are of my mother in the kitchen cooking for our family of 4. Fish steamed in a wok with soy sauce, ginger, and green onions. Chicken wings deep fried in a wok with lots and lots of garlic. Tomatoes and eggs cooked in, you guessed it, a wok served over rice. I would watch her from the island, mesmerized as she took control of the kitchen, quietly cooking, sometimes singing to herself, adding a pinch of this and a dash of that. While my parents gave my brother and me a loving home, these home-cooked meals around a dining table, a roof over our heads, embraces and kisses when we needed them, my mother couldn't say the same about her own upbringing. Women of my grandmother's generation didn't tend to express love or give affection outwardly in the way that I did growing up, and in the way that movies and television shows in America portrayed it. When I asked my mom if she had a special family recipe she could remember her mother making for her, she couldn't think of anything specific at first. Because by the time it was safe, or at least safe enough for her to be in the kitchen, she was the one in charge of feeding her 3 younger siblings, and suddenly she became the sole cook of the family. They lived in Diamond Hill in Kowloon, considered one of the poorest neighborhoods in Hong Kong. Despite its opulent name, the area didn't contain any diamonds, and Diamond Hill was simply a mistranslation of the Cantonese junsek, or to drill for rocks. Every hour that was available to my grandparents, including my grandmother, was spent at the factories making money. Eventually, my mom did think of one dish her mother had cooked her growing up: stir-fried minced pork with soybean sprouts. A humble dish of that time, for sure, yet one of the things I love to eat most today. One time in Hong Kong, when I was 5 years old, before my family and I were headed to the airport back to California, my grandmother cooked all of my favorite things, including this pork stir-fry. Simple and humble, but packed with flavor and texture, it's best served atop rice. The pork, marinated in soy sauce, a bit of sugar and cornstarch, balances the texture of the soybean sprouts, which, when cooked, soften and absorb whatever flavors you toss them with, rendering the dish not too salty, but deeply flavorful. Cooked over an open flame in an old iron wok that has seen its fair share of years, this dish holds the dinners of before and of the dinners to come. In my grandmother's living room, around a round laminate table, we all sat on colorful plastic stools and fold-out chairs, eating that stir-fry, among other delicious bites. The TV played quietly, and when there was a lull in conversation, it would be because something interesting was playing out on screen. But otherwise, surrounded by my uncles, aunts, and cousins, we'd sip and slurp all the dishes, modest in their ingredients, but filling in every way that counts. On television, love is shown with physical affection and verbal affirmations. TV grandmas have doting voices. They dole out freshly baked Toll House cookies. They pinch their cheeks too hard. In those early years, I didn't see those white grandmas reflected in my own. Sinewy, hard lives led, nary an I love you or I missed you. But during that dinner, it dawned on me. I didn't realize my grandmother missed me until she made this dish and said, pushing it toward me, I know you don't get to eat this often. Maybe food was her way of showing love. In the least, it was meaningful that she spent the time to make it for me, with me and my family in mind. It may have taken decades and an ocean to get to this realization, but it was through cooking, something my mother rarely saw her do when she was younger, that my grandmother, I realized, spoke the loudest. At an airport, hours later, my grandparents would be waiting with us in the boarding area. This was pre-9/11, obviously. There's a photo of my grandfather and me, and you can tell that he had just stopped crying. He always had big under-eye pouches, puffy enough that I remember pushing them softly until he would bat me away, smiling as he did so. But this time, the puffiness would be due to another goodbye he couldn't bear to give. Off we were, his family, to America again. My grandmother, on the other hand, would be stoic, waving goodbye as we boarded the plane. We talk about the generations fighting for the American dream, but what about the generations after? I wake up some days with a dull ache in my stomach and know it's a longing for these rare moments of unity after my family's diaspora. When I sit on the subway and hear young people my age speak with a Hong Kong affectation, I feel pangs for a home that maybe isn't really my own. But in these moments, I think that what I'm really longing for is the embrace of family outside of my immediate one in America, of my sense of home and place back in the motherland, with a laminate table, the aunts and uncles and cousins, and my grandmother's ambrosial stir-fried pork. Thank you.
Our next reader is Matt Ortile. Matt is the managing editor of Catapult magazine. Previously, he was the founding editor of BuzzFeed Philippines. He's written for BuzzFeed, Into, Out, Details, Town and Country, and Side B magazine. He graduated from Vassar College, which means he now lives in Brooklyn. He's also now working on a book of nonfiction. He's been describing it as if Roland Barthes and Carrie Bradshaw had a baby, and the baby was Filipino and on Grindr.
Hello po. Magandang gabi. No one's using this anymore, right? I'm just gonna... Fabulous. I'm going to be the millennial, the super millennial who's going to read off my phone. Cool. So thank you very much, Kate. Another round of applause for Kate Gavino, please, everybody. Stellar lady. Just went and moved to Paris. She was not going to be the girl who didn't go to Paris. Cool. So just some requisite knowledge. So we know Lolas are Filipino grandmothers. Can I just... Hold on. I'm really trying to work on my posture, so... Oh, that's better. So Lolas are Filipino grandmothers. And by changing the A to an O, you get a lolo, and that's a grandfather. And so just needed to know that, what to say. Talk about mine. So as Filipinos, we never call our family members by their names. Instead, they're often called by their jobs, their primary functions. So for example, lolo, doctor. Lolo, judge. Tita, baby. So for me, I had a Lola Madre. So she was a nun. By definition, she couldn't have been my mother's mother. She was one of my great aunts. She looked just like her sister, but had a more open, generous face than my grandmother. Whenever my mom and I visited Lola Madre at the convent, she was always ready with these cookies for me. And I don't know if she'd bake them or buy them. I don't remember if her habit was blue or gray. And I don't remember her actual name. She was only ever Lola Madre to me. Always a spiritual figure. Lola Madre died in the 90s when I was living in the Philippines. There were complications due to cancer. Late stage, nothing could be done. But, you couldn't tell. The way she was always smiling. There's this photo of me as a toddler and sitting in her lap and smiling is how I remember her. And there was Lola Madre's sister-in-law, Lola Ising. So unlike Madre, Ising isn't a vocation per se. But where did I go? But I believed as a kid that Ising stood for matriarch. Among her generation of lolas and lolos, Lola Ising was the one you turned to for warmth. She was easy to make laugh, whether in Cavite, a province an hour or 4 outside of Manila. It's very bad traffic there, so. Or in suburban Maine, where she stayed with her daughter, my Tita Malu. Tita Malu inherited Lola Ising's jovial nature, as well as her recipe for molo. It's a dumpling soup that Tita Malu often made with her cousin, my mom. But Tita Malu also inherited Lola Ising's breast cancer. Daughter was survived by mother, who then died a few years later. And this was in the early 2000s, around the time my mom and I moved to the States to follow the path her family paved. And I'm sure there's photos of me with Tita Malu and Lola Ising, but I remember them best when I see head wraps, which they wore when they lost their hair to chemotherapy. And there was Lola Ising's other sister-in-law, my mother's mother, Lola May. May was her name, and the same name she gave my mother. She also passed down her suplada qualities among her other genes, which my mom tries to curb and suppress whenever her temper flares up. Lola May was dismissive, spiteful, but ultimately harmless. To me, at least. My mother and Lola May had their differences, but my mother made good on the child's duty to take care of her parents, especially when Lola May was homebound with dementia. Lola May died, surprise, in my freshman year of college, so my mother buried her mother alone. It was a long year. My mother had just annulled her marriage to my father, and she reassumed her married name, and that was a nice thing for her. She really loved that. But it was chilling, though, she said. She told me this over the phone. It was weird holding her death certificate. Here was May Manahan holding a document that said May Manahan was dead. She also had breast cancer. Both Mays did. So if you know how cancer works, and I was made to early on, it wasn't a surprise that breast cancer found my mother as well. She's doing fine, thank you for asking. Her hair is growing back, but she's keeping it short in a matrona pixie cut. She's working again as well as a certified health coach. I was catching up with her on the phone this weekend. She sent me a link to a segment that she did on like a radio show, and she's now coaching a priest who was recently diagnosed. She's doing a lot, as much as she can, now that she's on the other side of a mastectomy and chemo. So I think Lola May inspires my mom. Not in the good faith way where you want to be just like that person, quite the opposite, in fact. Lola May never worked a day in her life as the heiress presumptive to a shoemaking empire that fell by the time she was married, so what was the point? My mother, on the other hand, has worked every day in her life since her teens, whether it's school, as an employee, as a business owner, and on beating cancer. When I told my mother I don't want children, she was not disappointed. It meant she wouldn't become a Lola May herself. She refuses to end up like her mother, and as such, my mother does enough good for 2 May Manahans. But in a way, in avoiding her mother's fate, she's done so in her honor. Do better than me, mothers always say. I lost my place again. I tried to connect with someone in the audience and I lost my place. Do better than me, mothers always say. So I guess that's what the May in Lola May stands for. The possibilities in my family, what we fear and what we want. Lolas, the mythic capital L Lolas, I conceive as eternal presences. Even when they pass away, they're present. Their jobs, their primary functions are to haunt me. Lola multo, if you will. Or, I suppose in the plural, Lolas multo. In my head, they've always been closer to God, remembered as martyrs, represented what we might become. They might inform, in the subtlest ways, what the future might look like, what waits around the corner. When I think of my Lolas, I think of cancer. And I think of what's hereditary. But apart from the threat of the emperor of maladies, I can prize everything else that runs through my veins. I think of the bravery with which the women in my family face their futures, however short, and the grace with which each one met her share of our genetic estate. I see both those qualities in my mother, who resembles the mothers and madres before her. I'm told I look like her. That's where I get my looks. And so, by transitive property, I look like my Lolas too. As Filipinos, the middle name we're given is often our mother's maiden name. So I was born Matthew Manahan Ortile. Manahan, from the Tagalog, roughly translates to what is to be passed down, inheritance. And mine, from my Lolas, with it the bravery and grace, the chance to do good and to do better, I have been honored to treasure. Thank you.
Ingat, thank you. So next is Rakesh Satyal. He's the author of No One Can Pronounce My Name, a novel about a close-knit community of Indian Americans navigating life in suburban Ohio. His first novel, Blue Boy, won the 2010 Lambda Literary Award for Gay Debut Fiction and the 2010 Prose Poetry Award from the Association of Asian American Studies. He was a recipient of a 2010 fellowship in fiction from the New York Foundation for the Arts and 2 fellowships from the Norman Mailer Writers Colony. His writing has appeared in New York Magazine, Vulture, Out Magazine, and The All. The senior editor at Atria Books, a division of Simon & Schuster, he edits and writes in Brooklyn.
Hello. Thank you so much, Kate, for organizing this and for having me. I don't always sound like Milton from Office Space. I had a very harrowing thing happen a month ago where I unexpectedly fainted on the subway platform and almost fell on the tracks and landed on my face. And as I said to my husband, my smile is the only thing I've ever unequivocally liked about the way I look. So it knocked out my teeth and they put them back in. So I now look like this. And it'll all be fixed. Thank you. Teeth can be fixed. Moral of the story, don't stand near the end of the subway platform. Ever. That's also why I just feel so disheveled. I look kind of like an Adam Sandler character if he took a nap. So anyway, you forgot one part of my bio. I'm the New York Times bestselling author of Pachinko. So anyway, I realized as I was preparing for this event that actually I realize one of the reasons why I'm often tend to write strong women of a certain age in my fiction is because I didn't grow up with my grandmothers. They actually passed away when both of my parents were relatively young. My mother was 16 when her mother passed away, and my father was 4 when his passed away. And the only time I met a grandmother was my father's second wife, whom my mother claimed was a witch. The one time that I met her was when we went to India when I was 4, and my parents sequestered us in a room, my brothers and me, and went to go talk to her, and she gave me the evil eye, or gave us the evil eye, and the next morning my brother woke up with dysentery or something. I don't know what it was. So that's my memory. One of my favorites, I realize now in retrospect about thinking about this, that one of my favorite sections to write in my novel, No One Can Pronounce My Name, was about the character who is a grandmother's age, to kind of Matt's point, doesn't ever have a grandchild because the 2 children, for reasons you find out in the book, never have children. So I wanted to read a section from that part because I realized in processing this that I was kind of writing this grandmother age character, but the way I found my way into her was writing her as a younger person because I didn't have a frame of reference easily to think about somebody who would immediately be that age. So even though the novel begins with her at the older age, something about the center of it felt like it was this part of the book. So I'm just going to read a short section from that, and her name is Parvati. Her parents named her Parvati not because of the goddess, but because it sounded like parivartana, the word meaning change. They needed a change. Her father was a farmer on a flat plain of land with a dozen sullen cows. All of the cows had died the summer of her birth, when the sun was so hot that it looked larger than the face of the person right next to you. A dozen dead cows was the gravest luck, was actually no luck at all. Bad luck was a term for something that didn't exist. You either had good fortune or you had none. They named her Parvati, and everyone imagined Shiva's consort, beautiful and supine on a lotus. But they wanted her to be Shiva himself, strong and determined, no slave to a field of dead cows. A neighbor boy, Ashwin, who lived a long field and a mountainous ridge away, gave her a pair of overalls. He took them off himself and was naked. Neither of them thought anything of it, though Parvati had never seen anything like the lazy flop at his waist. She took the cross of cloth onto her body, wore it until it stank of dirt. Her room, small, wooden, a third of her home, was both spacious and oppressive. Sitting on her cot, she painted her toenails red and wanted another girl to admire the job. She practiced kisses against her arm and imagined that her arm looked like her, but with long hair. She led the new cows into their pen while pushing her short hair behind her ears. At dinner, at their table of 5 wooden planks, a kerosene lamp quivering on one of its joints, she touched herself in her overalls in front of her parents and didn't realize until she was back in her room when her center shivered that what she had just experienced was not to be discussed with others yet. She turned on her side and nuzzled her arm. "What are we going to do to have Parvati meet someone?" her mother said, resting her forehead on her hands. She had given birth to Parvati at 50, and since she had grown up in Delhi, she knew how strange this was. She had escaped this farm because of it. "There's the boy over there," said her father, sipping a frothy cup of milk while nodding to the ridge far away. Her mother kept rubbing her forehead into her hands, and Parvati pulled up the overall straps at her shoulders, ran her tongue under her lower lip, and walked into the field. Over the ridge, there were other people who would know more, who wouldn't put their heads in their hands, but who would put a hand on her shoulder and point to something on a blackboard. She'd seen this in a newspaper. She knew that all of this was temporary. She would be here for a time and then go somewhere else for a time and would end up in America. All she had to do was sip her milk and study the wooden walls of her room and wait for it to happen. Soon she left the farm and took a job as a seamstress so that she could pay for her schooling. She understood that not everyone behaved the way that she did. They gave her weird looks as they shuffled the sabji on their plates and yelled at each other under frenzied ceiling fans. She wore overalls as a matter of course, and men, more so than they did with most women, picked at the cloth on her legs and ran their hands over her stomach. She kept her hair short, and she became so accustomed to the feeling of men's spit against her neck that she couldn't tell it apart from the landing of mosquitoes. When she spoke with other women, she stood with a hand on one hip and a snack in the other, and wiped her hands on the front of her clothes when she was finished. They found this distasteful, clicking their tongues and dispersing, but she had seen South Indians who dipped their entire forearms into their plates of food and licked the length of food off with their tongues, so she didn't understand why her behavior was so off-putting. One day, when she was feeling particularly alert during her literature class, she raised her hand 6 times and answered 6 different questions assuredly. After class, the teacher sat on her desk and looked at her over the glasses on his nose. His manner was generally mild, but he could be wry and had an annoying habit of overusing the word perhaps. "How is your English so good? Are you a diplomat's daughter, perhaps?" People wondered this about her often. Her casual appearance read as the arrogance of snobbery. "No," she replied. "Then how did you learn?" She was genuinely surprised by this question in light of where it was being asked. She held an open palm toward Ivanhoe, which they were reading in class. "Through literature." Her professor sighed through his nose, a grumble crawling up his throat. "That is a very rare thing, you know, for someone, especially a woman, to learn English in such a fashion, and so well." She had nothing to say to this, not because of shyness, but because of spite. She hated this type of attitude. Already in the scant time that she had been in Delhi, she had seen how little women could become in men's eyes, smaller than men's eyes, smaller than the reflections in men's eyes. The professor, dyspeptic by her silence, rubbed his stomach. "I think that perhaps you are too advanced for this course. Perhaps you should think of taking one of the graduate courses." "Perhaps I should," she said, getting up. She heard him stifle a burp as she walked out of the room. Down the hallway she went to the registrar's office and demanded to be switched into a graduate course on rhetoric and the work of Kant. She was sitting in it and raising her hand the next day. Thank you.
All right, and so now it's my turn. I'll be reading an illustrated essay, and I'm using this clicker for the first time, so forgive me if I fuck it up. Okay. All right, so 2 Lolas. My idea of what a Lola is was shaped at an early age. My mom's mother moved to Texas from the Philippines in the 80s to take care of my sister and me. When you think of a traditional old-school Lola, that was my Lola Salud. She was a devout Catholic and obsessed with feeding everyone constantly. For my entire childhood, she made all the rules. The list of things we weren't allowed to do was long and exhausting, and usually justified by a seemingly random consequence. Don't sit too close to the TV, cancer. Don't go to sleep with wet hair, blindness. Don't sleep next to a working fan, catch a cold. Don't watch the microwave while it's working, cancer again. Don't drink from plastic water bottles, cancer. And don't sleep with the windows open. You can catch a cold and you'll let in rapists. The list of things we could do were much shorter. We could go to church every day, supplemented with decades of the rosary throughout the day. We could marry a good man and have children immediately. We could become a nurse, pharmacist, or a physical therapist. And we had to put family above literally everything. So as a self-absorbed child, I never asked my grandmother much about her life. I saw her every day, ate most of my meals with her, and we watched a considerable amount of daytime talk shows together and peeled garlic for hours. But we never really talked. She was a loving Lola, but she was not very gentle. When she held your hand to cross the street, her grip usually left bruises. She didn't sing us lullabies to go to sleep. She monotonously smacked our asses and repeated the word tulog until we drifted off into an uneasy sleep. One thing you need to know about my Lola is she had the loudest voice I've ever heard. When she called you on the phone, you had to hold the phone a good foot away from your ear to protect your hearing. She wasn't allowed in most movie theaters. She could wake babies up from across the hallway. Her voice was just booming. So related to all of this, it's kind of a well-known secret that immigrants love secrets. I gained my knowledge of my Lola's past in a very roundabout way. So at church, we were forced to go to confession regularly. My Lola would go into a confessional booth, and without even having to press my ear against the door, I could hear everything. And my Lola wasn't like the rest of us, recycling the same 5 boring sins over and over again. Every time she confessed, she went all in. She'd recount incredible stories and vivid details to the priest, and I would listen every time. It was as epic as any biblical story. So that's really the only way I know any of my family's secrets. Like any ungrateful apple, it wasn't until I moved away from home to go to college here in New York that I fully appreciated what an amazing Lola I had. You don't realize how much you rely on that suffocating form of love until it's gone. She passed away my sophomore year of college, and of course I was devastated. I didn't realize how much I missed her until a few years had passed. I was roaming the city without a Lola, not realizing what exactly I was missing. A Lola's love and protection is very specific and hard to replace. And that is when I met a woman named Nanita. I met Nanita at a nursing home in Harlem. At that point in my life, I had begun regularly volunteering at nursing homes and senior centers around the city. After art school in Brooklyn and living in the Greenpoint equivalent of an Asian sorority house, I think I wanted to spend more time with people who weren't my age for a change. I hate people who call themselves old souls, but I think I've always gotten along with senior citizens in a way that wasn't as easy with people my own age. So that's why I started volunteering. Nanita's nursing home held a program every Sunday where volunteers took senior citizens on walks around Central Park. Nanita was the first Filipino senior citizen I had ever met at a nursing home, and we hit it off immediately. Nanita seemed like the complete opposite of my Lola. She was 94 years old and had traveled to every continent except Antarctica. She had moved to New York to finish her PhD when she was in her 20s, and she stayed here to work for a textbook publisher. She had lived in the East Village for over 50 years. Most importantly, as she repeatedly told me, she had never ever married. She just didn't trust men. Exhibit A.
I'm teaching you only. You have to be careful because some men are foolish, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you but just take care of yourself.
The topic of men was something we talked about constantly. Or rather, it's something Nanita talked about constantly. She had never married or had children, and she was really proud of this. She had had many suitors, but none of them had left much of an impression on her. Because of her advancing age, she tended to repeat herself. And the one thing she liked to tell me the most was to never get married. Men take up all your energy, she'd say. They only want things their way, and once you're married, your life is never your own again. Her 3 sisters were all married to various degrees of success, and she often used them to back up her point. This served as further contrast to my own Lola, who worshipped my loving yet flawed Lolo. After we first met, I regularly visited her at the home. We spent our time together looking through our photo albums, which showcased the many, many trips she had taken in her lifetime. When you first entered her room, the first thing you saw was a giant framed portrait of her on a camel in front of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. This was her proudest possession, and it was my favorite photo of her. She had taken all of her trips alone, and she was very proud of this. Sorry. Nanita's individualism was my favorite thing about her, as I related to it so deeply. My Lola had never understood why I would want to move away so far away from my family. It was strange to finally have someone who felt the same way as me. It was even stranger for that someone to be a woman who resembled my Lola so much. After a while, visiting Nanita became a regular part of my schedule. She lived in one of the nicest nursing homes I have ever visited, but she still had things stolen from her room or had nurses who neglected her needs. I brought her simple things that made her happy, like durian jam or ensamadas. Sometimes I took her out to lunch to Woodside, a trip that often took 4 to 5 hours, since she was so frail and moved so slow. But she enjoyed it nonetheless. The deeper my friendship with Nanita grew, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt in the back of my mind. I had never had this kind of relationship with my own Lola. Obviously, I had been closer to my own Lola, as the woman had bathed me as a child and shared my DNA. But when she was alive, I had never spent hours talking to her like I did with Nanita. I had never heard her hilarious childhood stories, only the shocking tales I had heard through the confessional walls. Despite my guilt, it was nice to have a Lola figure in my life again. Like I mentioned, a Lola's guidance is different from that of a parent or a best friend or a partner. It was a pleasant shock to have this guidance in my life again. It was like having a life preserver, having someone who had enough life experience to make any of your own problems seem inconsequential, or at the very least, fleeting. A few months later, I introduced Nanita to my boyfriend. I was terrified, but she liked him. She didn't even bring up how men were scum in front of him. At that point, Nanita had met my mother, my brother, and now my boyfriend. She felt like a vital part of my life. And that's when I dropped the ball. I've had shitty friends before, and I've been that shitty friend. But this time, I was a self-absorbed uppo again, who got wrapped up in my own life, work, traveling, and making enough time for everyone. It somehow ended up that a month passed before I was able to visit Nanita again. She had a cell phone, but the only person who called her was her niece who lived in Singapore. I had her phone number, but the few times I had tried to call her, she never picked up, as she wasn't really sure how to use the phone in the first place. So I had stopped trying to contact her on it altogether. So when I finally visited the nursing home again, I was met with a locked door. I went downstairs to reception, which is when I found out that Nanita had moved. I was in such a shock that it wasn't until a week or so later that I called the nursing home and asked for a forwarding address or phone number. They forwarded me to an answering machine, so I left a message, and another one a few days later. Weeks went by, and I would occasionally Google Nanita and pray that an obituary wouldn't appear. In my head, I imagined that her niece had moved to an amazing waterfront senior care facility in Singapore. I had no idea where she had gone. But despite that, I wanted her to be somewhere where she was as happy as she was on that camel in front of the pyramids. When more months went by, I got used to not having our friendship anymore, to not having a Lola, but this only made me miss Nanita and my real Lola more. I can't reiterate it enough, but there's really something about the binding protection of a Lola that makes you feel invincible, constantly protected. And I took that feeling for granted twice in my life. I still think of my Lola and Nanita every day. Last year, I went on a vacation to Egypt with my boyfriend, but I insisted on taking my very own solo photo on a camel in front of the pyramids. I wanted Nanita to be proud of me, even though she'd never see the photo. At the same time, I could hear my Lola yelling at me to get out of the sun and cover up. I recently realized just how stupid I was being, and I have begun asking my mother more questions about my Lola. I found out her Lola owned one of the largest ice cream brands in the Philippines, and that she met my Lola at a boarding house, where the first thing he saw was her legs coming down the stairs, and his eyes popped out of his head like a cartoon wolf. And as for Nanita, I still have her phone number, and every once in a while I dial it, and I hope she picks up, because I still have so much to ask her. Thank you. Thank you. So there are copies of my book in the back, and I'll be signing them. And even if you don't buy a book, I made these special edition Lola prayer cards, which are free for everyone if you want to grab one. So thank you again for coming out tonight. It was great hearing everyone's stories, and call your Lola tonight.